Coming soon, The Assassination, an investigation into a true story that shook the world. A new podcast from the BBC World Service. Subscribe to The Assassination now, and you'll get every episode automatically.
This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news compiled in the early hours of Wednesday, the 27th of December. I'm Valerie Sanderson with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, can Liberia achieve its first democratic transition of power in more than 70 years?
This process happens and it's peaceful and the transition takes place, I think that's going to be a historic moment for Liberia. I think post-election, that's when all the hard work begins.
The former president of Peru, Alberto Fujimori, has asked Peruvians to forgive him for letting them down. Also, tackling a shortage of priests in one of the world's most secular societies.
I think a lot of Swedes do believe in something. We just don't have the language to define that and define that as God.
And we take a look back at the events of 2017 with some of the BBC's foreign correspondents. But first, votes are being counted in Liberia, where a presidential election runoff has been taking place between a former international football star, George Weah, and the current Vice President, Joseph Boakai. Both candidates say they would respect the result. So, what sort of country will the next president inherit? James Menendez spoke to Liberian political analyst Rob Telpele.
Most Liberians, I would say, from the last stats and figures that I received, 50+% of the population lives below the poverty line. So most Liberians are really, really poor. There's a small, very small elite number of Liberians who've been able to benefit from the democratic or the peaceful dividends that's come in as a result of President Sirleaf's administration. Most Liberians are destitute. They have trouble sending their children to school. They have trouble accessing health care, and Ebola definitely exposed the inequalities in healthcare provisions in the country. I would certainly not say most Liberians are wealthy or well off.
And why haven't people got any richer, given that there has been peace? I mean, is it corruption that stops any of that natural wealth trickling down to ordinary people?
I think corruption is a part of the equation, certainly. Like I said, there's been lots and lots of economic mismanagement. So a number of appointed officials have gotten their hands caught in the treasury, right, in the national coffers, stealing, and some of them have not been prosecuted. In fact, the vast majority of them have not been prosecuted. And I should say alleged, because these are claims against them. I think also, when you have an over-reliance on commodity prices, particularly natural resources, it takes a while for that to trickle down into the revenue base of the country and then further trickle down to going towards healthcare management, going towards education. And 12 years does not really give a president, no matter how wonderful they are, sufficient time to do a lot of the work that they sort of, promise in their campaigns. But I think corruption has been number one. I think number two, there's also been things that have been beyond the control of the administration. So commodity prices tanking, although we could have diversified our revenue base by focusing on manufacturing and industry and the service sector, and not just focusing on extracting natural resources and relying on that to boost the economy. So it's a combination of mismanagement. It's also a combination of a very short time period that's been given to President Sirleaf to take on the mantle of leadership.
And so what are the prospects looking ahead? I mean, do either of the two candidates, Joseph Boakai and George Weah, do they offer some prospect of things getting better, or is it more of the same?
Some would argue that Joseph Boakai, who's the current VP, has led Liberia for the past 12 years and is complicit in some of the economic mismanagement. I think for many people, he's a status quo candidate. He's someone who represents continuity and stability. He's made promises that range from focusing on infrastructure, particularly roads, to, the ports and looking at electricity, electrifying the entire country. But the question that many of us keep asking ourselves is, how are you going to do that with an economy that's such a difficult state? George Weah is a bit of a wild card. He hasn't made any concrete promises. He speaks in very broad-based terms, but his constituency is diehard, right? They're going to turn up at the polls. And I think the challenge for him would be, because there's so much euphoria around his potential administration, there are going to be demands that he deliver. And the question is, how is he going to how is he going to be able to deliver? He hasn't answered that question to the Liberian electorate. So that question mark is still something that's pending in the eyes of a lot of Liberians, unfortunately.
But if there is a smooth democratic transition, and clearly there have been some worries about the electoral process, but if broadly that happens, that in itself is quite an achievement, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's a watershed moment in Liberia's history. So the last time we had a transition of power from a democratically elected head of state to another democratically elected head of state was in 1944. So it's been 74 years. And so if this process happens and it's peaceful and the transition takes place, President Sirleaf leads office in the third week of January 2018, as she should constitutionally. I think that's going to be a historic moment for Liberia. I think post-election, that's when all the hard work begins.
Is there any risk of a return to war, or are those days well behind Liberia?
I think those days are well behind. I mean, I've spoken to a number of different international media outlets about this. I think any sort of alarmist statements about the electoral process being violent is unfair and definitely unhelpful. Liberians have been incredibly peaceful, incredibly patient throughout this 6-week electoral litigation process where the runoff was delayed. And there have been no skirmishes. There's been no violence. And I don't think today is going to change that. I think Liberians have signed on to the fact that they want to maintain peace, they want to maintain stability, because that's the only way transformation is going to take place.
Robtel Paley, a Liberian political analyst, and the results of the election aren't expected for a few days yet. The former president of Peru, Alberto Fujimori, has asked the country's people to forgive him 2 days after he was pardoned over corruption and human rights abuses. Speaking from his hospital bed, Mr. Fujimori accepted he'd made mistakes during his term in office.
I am aware that what resulted during my administration on the one hand was well received, but I recognise that on the other hand I have also disappointed other compatriots. To them I ask forgiveness from the bottom of my heart. I cannot fail to express my deep gratitude for the complex step that the President has taken that commits me, in this new stage in my life, to strongly support his call for reconciliation.
President Pablo Kaczynski's decision to pardon Mr. Fujimori sparked protests by Peruvians who think he should have served his term in full. Our America's editor Leonardo Rocha told me why Mr. Fujimori had been pardoned.
The president, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, went on national TV to say that he couldn't let a former president of Peru die in prison, that Mr. Fujimori is old and frail, he's 79, and that justice is not about vengeance. But many people in Peru don't believe that, and that's the reason we've had protests since the pardon was announced on Christmas Day, on Monday. People believe that Mr. Kuczynski made a deal with supporters of Mr. Fujimori in Congress to survive politically. He was facing an impeachment vote on Thursday that he was expected to lose. And then, for some strange reason, about 10 people in the Fujimori party didn't turn up to vote, and he survived that vote by a narrow margin. So that's a reason. I mean, the former president is not liked by many. It's a split in the country, but also people think there was a deal and that they were not being told the truth.
Will Alberto Fujimori's apology, will that make any difference?
Well, in a way, I mean, his apology was a semi-apology because he said he regrets that he let people down. He didn't say, I made mistakes. He was sentenced for human rights abuses. There were 2 very notorious massacres, and some 70,000 people are estimated to have died in the 10 years when he was in power, and he was fighting the left-wing guerrillas, which were also very violent. So I don't think there will be much difference in the opinion that people have about Mr. Fujimori. What the media in Peru are saying is that he is going to have a big influence on the party that is led at the moment by his daughter, and he will be a political force in Peru. The future for President Kuczynski, that looks very, very doubtful because he's weak now. He had to make a deal, apparently, with the opposition.
Leonardo Rocha. A chess double world champion is boycotting the latest world championship competition because it's being held in Saudi Arabia. Anna Muzyczak, who's from Ukraine, says she's unwilling to abide by codes of women's behaviour in the kingdom because they'd make her feel like a second-class citizen.
This was a very difficult decision. I think that the championships of such a level as world championships shouldn't be organized in the country where the human rights and especially the rights of women are violated. A woman who goes outside, she should wear the abaya and hijab, and also she cannot go alone. She should be always accompanied by a man. All these things a little bit strange to me as a person who would like to have a free choice.
It's a different culture, it's a different country. It has nothing to do with chess, really, does it?
Yes, but somehow now these two things have been mixed, and if we want to go there for a chess competition, we also should obey the laws of that country.
This is a big decision for you financially, isn't it? You could have earned a very great deal of money from this competition.
Yes, that's why to take this decision was even more difficult, because this time the prize fund in Saudi is very high, the record prize fund. If I decided to play there, then I could have good chances to win.
This is not just your protest, this is the protest of your sister as well. Tell me about her.
Maria is also a world champion, and I am happy that she also decided not to go, so that we stay together. I hope that more players would agree with us and take the decision not to go there.
What do you think of the fact that the Israeli players cannot go there?
It's a pity, and in some way it's also violation of the statute of our World Chess Federation. FIDE events must be held in the country where all players can come. But this time Israeli players can't come. They were refused to get the visas. And also the players from Qatar and from Iran, they also had very big problems. They got the permission to come only yesterday, so they can't play in the rapid event, but maybe they will come for the blitz.
You've played chess in Iran, haven't you? Presumably you were also required to cover up and dress modestly there?
Yes, my sister Maria, she didn't play in Iran. She decided even to skip that event. But for me, I won 2 World Championship titles last year, and I also wanted to win the last World Championship. I decided to go there, and I felt myself how it is to be in hijab all the time, and all this pressure when women don't have the same rights as men. That's why it was even more wish not to play in Saudi, because in Saudi it seems to be even worse. Lately, women were allowed to drive the cars. Also, I heard they are going to build some kind of city where women can dress however they want. But at the moment, I think it's not good enough.
Chess champion Anna Muzichuk speaking there to Paul Henley. British students must be able to hear and challenge controversial views during their years of study, or academic institutions could face fines. That's according to Joe Johnson, a government minister who says some universities and student groups have refused to allow speakers advocating extremism or disputed points of view on campus. Emily Unia reports.
In his speech at a Jewish cultural festival in Birmingham, Mr Johnson criticised the practice of no platforming, when student unions and other university groups oppose or ban speakers with what are considered to be offensive or unacceptable views. He made it clear that other practices, such as banning certain books from libraries, were also undermining free speech. Mr Johnson said young people should have the resilience to hear and challenge controversial opinions, and universities should be places that open minds, not close them.
If we fail to do that, we will soon be on a slippery slope that ends up with a society that's less able to make scientific breakthroughs, less able to be innovative, and frankly less able also to resist injustice. We need people to be able to deal with the uncomfortable.
But Dr Pam Lowe, a senior lecturer in sociology and policy at Aston University in Birmingham, said the government's anti-radicalisation programme, known as PREVENT, was part of the problem because it imposed restrictions on some speakers who were deemed to be offensive.
It's made having external visitors, external speakers, a lot harder for all universities at all time. So I think it's slightly ironic that the government is now accusing the universities of having a lack of free speech.
From next April, a new regulator, the Office for Students, will have the power to fine, suspend or even deregister universities that fail to uphold free speech. Mr Johnson said he expected the watchdog to use these powers if necessary.
Emily Unia. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And now Owen Bennett-Jones will tell you about another of our podcasts.
Our brand new podcast series, The Assassination, is about an unsolved murder with global ramifications. It's an investigation into the assassination of one of the world's most prominent politicians, Pakistan's Benazir Bhutto. Subscribe now and you won't miss episode 1. Search for The Assassination where you get your podcasts.
Now back to the Global News podcast. In France, prosecutors have begun an investigation into salmonella contamination of formula baby milk made by the company Lactalis. I asked our Europe editor Mike Sanders if we know exactly what happened.
Well, the firm Lactalis thinks that there was a problem at its plant in the northwest of France, a place called Craon. It had refurbishment work done there in the first half of the year, and it thinks that the bacteria that causes salmonella somehow got introduced to the plant at that point. Initially, it was thought it was in the evaporation tower where the milk is dried for the powder, but it now says that the bacteria may well have spread to the rest of the plant. So what it's done, it's recalled every product that's been made at that particular plant since mid-February, because that's the production line that it thinks is most likely to be affected.
And quite a few babies have fallen ill, haven't they?
In France, we think that about 20 babies or children under 6, to be more precise, have fallen ill. As far as we know, they've all recovered. The company was asked if any child outside France had fallen ill, and they said that they were not aware of any case.
But they hesitated, didn't they, after the first recall back in December? Is that what the investigation will consider as well?
I'm sure that's one of the points they'll be looking at. They started recalling products on the 2nd of December, about 700, and they then were told that the procedures they'd put in place at that point were not sufficient, so they had to do a second recall of another 600 or so products at a later point in December. And those products are shipped abroad. Some of them go to Britain. China is another place they go to, several countries. But as I say, as far as we know, the contamination hasn't affected people abroad so far.
But the advice, presumably, is if you have some of this formula milk in the cupboard, do not use it.
Lactalis have produced a list of all the products they've recalled, so you can consult on their website and see if you've bought one of those products. And the advice is either take it back to the shop, bin it, or if you really are stuck, perhaps you're snowed in somewhere, then you can make the milk up, but then boil it for 2 minutes and leave it to cool before giving it to your child. And
how seriously is this whole case being taken in France?
Very seriously indeed. They've put it under the control of a police unit, an armed police unit at that's responsible to the Interior Ministry. And its normal remit includes things like organ trafficking and the trade in endangered species. So I think that gives you some indication that they are taking it very seriously indeed.
Our Europe editor, Mike Sanders. A report recently in Sweden identified the jobs in which there are expected to be the greatest shortage of applicants in the coming 5 years, and those in which it'll be easiest to find a job. One of the professions in need of new blood caught the attention of our reporter, Keith Moore.
The choir in Västerås Cathedral is practising ahead of the Christmas period. It's always been the busiest time of the year for NEWSCENTER, the Dean of Västerås. She's been a priest for more than 40 years.
I think it's one of the most rewarding ways of living. You meet so many people and get to hear their life story. Where else do you talk about life and death and sort of have others to talk to on topics that are almost forbidden to talk about?
Hers is a profession where there's already a shortage, and she's one of 750 priests from the Church of Sweden's 3,000 priests due to retire in the next few years.
Since there is such a shortage of priests, most of our retired priests do step in and work over holidays or when somebody is ill, and they fill vacancies. Most probably I will be needed.
As well as using retired priests like her, Sweden's also planning to import some from other countries, particularly Finland.
Hello. Hello. Nice to meet you. Thanks
The
for
lack
doing
of
this.
priests is a concern to Vibeke Hemmerström, who's head of the biggest trade union in the Swedish Church, the Church's Graduate Association. They've been concerned about their members' workload for some time. Why does she think there aren't enough priests?
First of all, there hasn't been enough students who study theology. And when you ask why, well, obviously Sweden is a very secular country. But there's also the problem that the Church of Sweden itself, it's not known as a very good employer. As a matter of fact, it has made itself known as a bad employer, and that is a problem.
All our coffee?
Sweden needs more young people to train to become priests. I went to the Church's Educational Institute in the city of Uppsala to meet two people who are doing just that.
My name is Jonathan. I'm 26 years old and I'm studying to become a priest in the Church of Sweden.
And I'm Ellen, and I'm 25 years old, and I'm also studying to become a priest in the Church of Sweden.
Both are just 6 months from their ordination.
Being a Christian guy in Sweden when you're young is often like you are the Christian guy. There's not a lot of Christian guys.
I think being a priest is the best job in the world. You get to meet people in all different life situations, the happiest and the saddest, and you get to talk about God and talk about life and all things from the smallest parts to the great questions.
What, though, do the two soon-to-be priests think the Church of Sweden needs to do to attract both a new generation of worshippers and priests?
I think we have a challenge in the Church of Sweden to make Christianity relevant for the young people. How do we present this message about Jesus Christ? How do we make it relevant for the young people? How can we make them feel like they can apply this to their everyday life? And I think that's a challenge we have.
Yes.
Like with doing church services, how can we adapt them for the young people?
I think in Sweden we say that we are a secular country, yeah. But I think maybe we're not that secular as we think. I think a lot of Swedes do believe in something. We just don't have the language to define that and define that as God. And I think that's a big challenge for the Church of Sweden, that we need to learn people the language of God, learn the language of faith, and to have that language become a part of their everyday lives.
Keith Moore reporting from Sweden. Now, as 2017 draws to a close, it's time to look back at the year's major events. We brought together a team of BBC correspondents to reflect on what happened around the world in the past 12 months. James Menendez spoke to Rupert Wingfield-Hayes in Tokyo, Anne Soy in Nairobi, our Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen, our Europe editor Katya Adler, and first to Katty Kay in Washington.
Every week it seems that there's a full month's news in a single day. We wake up in the morning and look at our phones and think, oh my goodness, what's the president tweeted today? And you feel incredibly lucky to be at the kind of front row of watching this extraordinary, unprecedented presidency. And then you also realize you've run out of ways to say that it's extraordinary, unprecedented. But Mr. Trump is changing the face of America, and he's certainly changing the way that America interacts with the rest of the world. And whilst much of what he does domestically will be changed, I think the big story about Donald Trump is that he's going to change, probably irrevocably, America's relationship with other countries, and America will no longer be, I think, the world's preeminent global leader in the way that it has been since the Second World War.
Jeremy, thinking about America's relationship with the rest of the world and, of course, in particular, the Middle East, what's changed because of the Trump administration?
Well, on one level, recently he's chucked a firework into the heart of it by agreeing with Israel's interpretation of essentially who owns Jerusalem. But I think there's a bigger story going on in the background, and that is America is not the factor that it was once in the region. Certainly for many, many years, the Americans essentially were the arbiter of a lot that went on there. But what we're seeing now, we're seeing, first of all, the Russians with President Putin have had, from his point of view, a very successful intervention in Syria. And one of the reasons, I think, why the Saudis are gearing up to what might become an actual confrontation with Iran is because they don't believe that the Americans are necessarily going to help them out very much anymore.
And what about Syria? Where are we now at the end of the year?
You can pretty much say now that the regime has won. The attempt to topple Assad has failed. Now, from the Assad family's point of view, they are way more secure. And that also means that if there was going to be any kind of a political process, they are certainly not going to vote for the end of their power and to go quietly. There's no way they're going to do that.
Of course, the one thing that's been really worrying people, and this is one for you, Rupert, is the tensions on the Korean peninsula. I just wonder how much louder the drums of war are beating now than at the beginning of the year, when to some extent some of those tests were dismissed as just the usual North Korean sabre-rattling.
We've gone from at the beginning of the year thinking it would be some years yet until North Korea has the capability of hitting the United States with a full-blown intercontinental ballistic missile, to, on the 28th of November, seeing them test one of those that can do it, with an 8,000-mile range and big enough and powerful enough to carry a large nuclear warhead. They can't, it seems, put a nuclear warhead on the top of it yet, but they, in September, tested a very powerful nuclear device, maybe up to 300 kilotons, compared to Hiroshima bomb, which was 18 kilotons. This is all a huge shock to everyone that North Korea has managed to do this. And then, of course, it's come against the background of President Trump's rhetoric and moving aircraft carriers and stealth bombers and fighter aircraft into the Korean peninsula on a regular basis. It has ramped up the whole feeling of crisis here, even if everybody is saying, look, no one wants war, we want peace, diplomacy must win out in the end. The sense in this region is that a small mistake on either side could lead to a conflict by accident because the tensions are now so high.
Let me come to you, Katya. I just wonder to what extent Europe is looking out, or whether actually this has been a year for Europe, the European Union, looking inwards and trying to put its own house in order.
I think it's very mixed. If you look at Angela Merkel, who's now dealing with a domestic political crisis and trying to form a government, she is somebody who always has her eye on the big picture, and whether she's looking at Brexit, Ukraine, North Korea, she is looking at that big picture, and she sees Brexit within that context. She's aware that Vladimir Putin would quite like to see the EU dissolve or at least weaken, and so for her, it's very much trying to keep Europe together in the face of all of those global challenges. And she would include China in that from a trade perspective. So she's very much a big picture kind of person. Move over to the United Kingdom, and for the rest of the European Union, they feel that the United Kingdom has been having a very long argument with itself this year. Even though the United Kingdom triggered the formal process to leave the European Union, it then started a massive debate internally about what kind of Brexit do we want, and do we actually want to leave? And that left the rest of the EU quite aghast and saying, please, tell us exactly what you want, and then we can talk the detail.
But have you seen attitudes amongst EU officials change over the year, from perhaps being sceptical that it might ever happen to at the end of the year recognising that that train has left the station?
I think that EU officials would say they accepted the reality of the situation a lot earlier than many Britons. Straight after the vote was phenomenal being in Brussels, because you just felt this shock after the vote here. Then they kind of went through a whole rapid sort of emotions, or not just in Brussels, but in all the main capitals of Europe. They felt betrayed, they felt angry, they were sad, and there was definitely this feeling that maybe they'll change their mind. That remains on the very, 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 very edges now. As far as the rest of the EU is concerned, they're assuming it is going to happen unless they're informed otherwise. But I think sometimes when you read the British press, there's a feeling that in EU circles there's a conspiracy to turn Brexit around. That is definitely not something that you pick up on. What has changed is how the UK is viewed. Britain was always put up on a pedestal. Our diplomacy was respected, our political system revered, and our press seen as free. We've fallen off that pedestal.
Let me bring in Anne. I wanted to talk about the fall of Mugabe, not just as a big story in itself, but also how it might resonate around the rest of the continent. What are your thoughts on that?
Nobody saw it coming, not even a day before. That was there just hours after he had been put under house arrest by the military. And, you know, for many Zimbabweans, they were really thrilled that that had happened. They're still trying to understand what exactly that means for them. They have a new president in power now, the former vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, and he has promised to reform the country, to improve the economy. He has called on the international community to lift sanctions. And even though Mr. Mnangagwa has been within the ruling party, ZANU-PF, as a senior member since independence, for many Zimbabweans, it's a new dawn.
Yes, and change next door too in South Africa. Lots of long-standing leaders moving into the past, would you say?
The new leader of the ANC is in a very strong position to lead the country after the elections in 2019. The president, Jacob Zuma, has been hit by numerous scandals. He has survived quite a number of votes of no confidence. And at this point in transition, South Africans and the rest of the continent will be watching. Is this the transition that is going to split the party? There is already talk about that.
James Menendez speaking there to Anne Soy, Katya Adler, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, Jeremy Bone and Catty Kay. And finally, the 24-year-old Tottenham Hotspur and England footballer Harry Kane has broken the record for the number of Premier League goals scored in one calendar year. He netted his second hat-trick in 3 days to register 39 goals for 2017 as Tottenham beat Southampton at Wembley. His total for both club and country is 56, 2 more than Barcelona and Argentina striker Lionel Messi. Harry Kane was clearly thrilled with his achievement.
It's been amazing. It's been a fantastic year, one I'm very proud of. Yeah, like I say, when you get compared to them players, the Messis and Shearers and stuff like that, it's what it's all about. So first and foremost, it's an unbelievable display again by the team, great result. And yeah, to get another hat-trick is just a great feeling to end the year.
And that's it from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Valerie Sanderson. Until next time, goodbye.